I waited and waited, and the days followed one another, gradually carrying away with them the fear that had paralyzed me. In truth, only very few of them passed without new developments, amidst constant interaction with my pupils. But such days wiped away, as with a sponge, the tormenting fantasies and hateful memories. I have already mentioned how I yielded to the extraordinary childish grace of my charges, having already learned to cultivate this within myself, and I invariably turned to this source for all it could offer. Of course, no words can express how strange it was to struggle with something whose existence I had only recently discovered. No doubt, this struggle would have required even greater effort had it not so often been crowned with success. At times, I wondered why my little charges did not guess how much that was strange I knew and thought about them. And the fact that all these strange things only made them more interesting did nothing to help keep them in the dark. I trembled at the thought that they might notice my excessive interest in them. In any case, even supposing the worst, as I often did in my musings, any tarnishing of these children's innocence, blameless and yet forever condemned, provided an additional reason to take the risk. There were moments when, yielding to an irresistible impulse, I would suddenly seize them in my arms and press them to my heart. And immediately I would say to myself, "What will they think? Am I giving myself away too much?" It was easy to sink into gloom, to become entangled in a wild confusion of thought about how much I might reveal. But, as I recall, the truthful account of those peaceful hours that still brought me joy lay in the fact that the immediate charm of my pupils still exerted its effect, even under the shadow of the possibility that they were acting with precise calculation. If the thought occurred to me that these little outbursts of passionate love for them might sometimes arouse their suspicions, I also remember racking my brains over whether there was something strange in the clearly exaggerated demonstrations of their love for me. During this time, they became extraordinarily, supernaturally attached to me, which seemed merely a graceful response to my own feelings, a response from children who are constantly caressed and indulged. The marks of respect they showed me, which they did not hesitate to display, truth be told, had a beneficial effect on me, as if I did not catch them in the act of displaying them intentionally. Never before, it seemed, had they tried so much for their poor governess. Not only did they learn better and better, which, of course, must have pleased her greatly, but they also entertained, occupied her, and surprised her, reading aloud, telling stories, acting out charades. They would suddenly pounce on her dressed as historical characters or animals, and, most importantly, they amazed her with recitations, which they had secretly memorized and endlessly declaimed. I never could fathom, and even now I cannot, the depths of that astonishing secret commentary and even more astonishing secret revision that canceled out, for me, the entirety of their behavior. From the very beginning, they showed aptitude for everything, showed an ease of perception, and, having started, they again and again achieved remarkable results. They did their simple lessons as if they loved them, and by virtue of their giftedness, they performed miracles in memorizing verse and prose. They not only appear before me as tigers or Romans, but also as Shakespearean heroes, astronomers, and navigators. This was so strange that, to this day, I can find no other explanation. Apparently, it was connected to my unnaturally indifferent attitude toward finding another school for Miles. I only remember deciding to leave the question open for a time, and this decision likely arose because his intellect manifested itself more and more strikingly. He was too clever, and a poor governess, a parson's daughter, could do him no harm. The most unusual, if not the brightest, thread in this tapestry of my thoughts was the impression, if I dare dwell on it, that his mental life was under some strongly stimulating influence. If it was not difficult to conclude that such a boy need not be hurried off to school, it was also glaringly obvious that to expel such a boy was more than surprising for a teacher. Let me add that in their company, and I now tried never to leave them alone, I failed to stumble upon the right clue. We lived in a haze of music and love, of successes and amateur theatricals. The musical sense in each of them was extraordinarily keen, but the elder especially possessed a marvelous gift for grasping and remembering. The piano in the schoolroom scattered incredible passages under his fingers, and when that was not happening, there was chatter in the corners, stories were composed, and to some stories an ending was attached in the merriest spirit to surprise me with something new. I myself had grown up with brothers, and it was no revelation to me that girls sometimes slavishly worship boys. But here was a boy in the world who showed such refined attention to the weaker sex, weaker both in age and in understanding, that it surpassed all probability. They both lived in great harmony, and to say they never quarreled or complained about each other would be to bestow upon them too exaggerated praise for their extraordinary meekness. Indeed, at times, indulging in such exaggeration, I noticed by certain signs that they had arranged between themselves for one to distract and occupy me while the other slipped away somewhere. In all diplomacy, it seems there is a naive side, and if my pupils deceived me, they certainly did so with minimal coarseness. And this quality manifested itself quite differently after a temporary lull. It seems to me that I am indeed treading water. I must take this step. In continuing the tale of what was loathsome at Bly, I am not only challenging credulity, which troubles me little, but, and this is quite another matter, I am reliving what I had to endure. I am traversing my entire path to its end all over again. There came a sudden hour after which, looking back, everything seems to have been unmitigated suffering. But I have at least reached the very heart of the matter, and the straight path to an exit is, without a doubt, the path forward. One evening. Nothing had led up to or prepared me for this evening. I felt the same chill breath that had wafted over me on the night of my arrival. But of that earlier breath, being lighter, as I have already mentioned, not a trace would have remained in my memory had my subsequent stay at Bly been less fraught. I had not yet gone to bed. I was sitting and reading by the light of 2 candles. At Bly, there was an entire room full of books, among them novels from the previous century with an unsavory reputation, which occasionally found their way even to our secluded house and appealed to the curiosity of my inexperienced youth. I recall that the book in my hand was Fielding's Amelia, and I was not at all sleepy. I remember further the general impression that it was terribly late, and I remember my peculiar reluctance to look at the clock. Finally, the white canopy that draped in the fashion of the time the head of Flora's little bed seemed to preserve the child's perfect repose. Of this I was firmly convinced. In short, although absorbed in my reading, I caught myself, upon turning a page and thus dispelling its entire enchantment, lifting my eyes from the book and fixing a steady gaze upon the door of my room. Then I listened, remembering how on that first night I had fancied something elusive was astir in the house. And then I heard the faint rustle of a window being pushed open, brushing against the half-drawn curtain. With all the caution that might have seemed magnificent had there been anyone to admire it, I laid the book on the table, stood up, and, taking a candle, quickly left the room for the corridor, which my candle scarcely illuminated, and, silently closing the door behind me, locked it. I cannot now say what led to this decision or what guided me, but I proceeded directly toward the vestibule and walked on, holding the candle high, until the tall window above the sharp turn of the stairs came into view. And here I instantly became aware of three things. In essence, they coincided in time, but followed one another like flashes. My candle went out from a sudden movement, and, drawing nearer to the uncovered window, I saw that it was no longer needed in the thinning pre-dawn gloom. Another moment, and without the candle it became apparent that someone was standing on the stairs. I speak of sequence, but it took less than a second to steel myself for this third encounter with Quint. The apparition had reached the landing halfway up the stairs and was thus closest to the window. There it stood as if rooted, fixing upon me the same intent gaze with which it had looked from the tower and from the garden. It recognized me just as I recognized it, and so, in the cold, pale twilight before dawn, under the faint gleam of light from the upper pane of the window, falling upon the polished oak of the staircase, we stood face to face, equally intense. This time he was utterly alive, a loathsome and dangerous being. But this was not the miracle of miracles. I reserve that term for a circumstance entirely different. The miracle lay in the fact that fear had undoubtedly left me and that everything within me was ready to meet and measure strength with Quint. Much has happened to me since that extraordinary minute, but, thank God, there was no more fear in me, and he knew I was not afraid of him. I became perfectly convinced of that a moment later. I was firmly certain that if I held out another minute, I would not have to reckon with him any longer, at least not now. And for that minute the encounter was as real and revolting as a meeting with a living person. Revolting as such encounters are between people when, late at night in a sleeping house, you come face to face with an enemy, a thief, a criminal. It was precisely the dead silence of our long, close scrutiny that lent the horror, great as it was, its sole supernatural quality. If I had met a murderer in this place, and at this hour, we would at least have spoken. Something would have happened between us in life. If nothing happened, at least one of us would have moved. The moment lasted so long that a little more, and I would have doubted whether even I myself were still alive. I cannot explain what happened next. I will only say that the very silence, which perhaps testified to my strength, became the element in which the apparition dissolved and vanished. I saw clearly. This vile scoundrel turned as he would have turned in life upon receiving his master's order, and as I watched his wretched back, which even a hump could not have made more misshapen, he descended the stairs and passed into the darkness where the next turn of the staircase was lost. For some time I remained on the upper landing, but soon realized that if my visitor had gone, he had gone completely, and then I returned to my room. The first thing I noticed by the light of the candle I had left burning was that Flora's little bed was empty, and here my breath caught with a horror that just 5 minutes before I had still been able to overcome. I rushed to where I had left the girl sleeping, to the bed deceptively draped by its white canopy. The silk coverlet and sheets were thrown about, and here my steps, to my immense relief, provoked an answering echo. I noticed a movement of the window curtain, and the child, all pink and drowsy, emerged from behind it. She stood before me in all her childish innocence, barely covered by her nightgown, with her pink bare feet and in the golden radiance of her curls. She looked very serious, and I had never before felt such a sense of losing something already attained, something that had so recently made my heart thrill with joy, as when she addressed me with a reproach. "You naughty thing, where have you been?" And instead of scolding her for disobedience, I found that I was the one at fault and had to explain myself. She, however, explained everything with the most charming, most fervent sincerity. Lying in bed, she had suddenly felt that I was not in the room and had jumped up to see where I had gone. From the joy of finding her, I sank onto a chair, only then feeling my weakness, and Flora pattered over to me and, settling herself on my lap, allowed me to embrace her, while the candle flame fell directly upon the marvelous little face, still pink from sleep. I remember closing my eyes for a second, submissively, consciously, as if before a flood of wondrous light streaming from the deep blue of her eyes. "Were you looking for me when you looked out the window?" I asked. "Did you perhaps think I was walking in the park?" "Yes, I thought someone was walking there." She didn't even pale, offering this to me with a smile. Oh, how I looked at her then! "And did you see anyone?" "Oh, no, oh," she objected with injured air, availing herself of the privilege of childish inconsistency, yet drawing out the negation with sweet affection. At that moment, and in the state my nerves were in, I was utterly convinced the child was lying. And if I closed my eyes again, it was before the dazzling glare of 3 or 4 paths that had opened before me. One of them tempted me for a minute with such extraordinary force that, resisting the temptation, I convulsively clasped my little girl in my arms, and it is a wonder she endured it without a cry, without a sign of fright. Why not declare everything to her at once and be done with it forever? Why not speak the truth, gazing into that lovely, illuminated little face? You understand it all, you see, and know that you see, and you have long suspected that I am sure of it too. So why not confess it frankly to me, so that we might at least live through it together and perhaps learn what our strange fate is doing to us and what it means? But my plea, alas, died away as quickly as it had arisen. Had I yielded to the temptation that moment, I would have been rid of, you will see yourself of what. Instead of taking that path, I sprang to my feet again, glanced at Flora's little bed, and chose the middle course that leads nowhere. "Why did you pull the canopy over the bed?" "So that I would think you were still there." Flora pondered lightly, then answered with her divinely airy smile. "Because I didn't want to frighten you." "But you thought I had gone out?" She decisively evaded the answer and turned her gaze to the candle flame, as if the question were irrelevant or as impersonal as Madame Marcette's textbook or the 9 times table. "Oh, you know, dear," she replied with perfect reasonableness, "you might have come back, and indeed you did come back." And a little later, when Flora had settled back into bed, I had to sit close beside her for a long time, holding her hand tightly, as proof that I felt how timely my return had been. You can imagine what my nights were like from then on. I kept vigil constantly until heaven knows what hour. I would choose moments when my pupil was undoubtedly asleep and, stealing into the corridor, would silently patrol it, making my way to that very spot where I had last met Peter Quint. But I never met him there again. I can state at once that I never saw him in the house again, either. On that same staircase, however, I barely escaped an encounter of a quite different kind. One evening, looking down from the upper landing, I saw a woman sitting on one of the lower steps, her back to me, bent forward with her head in her hands, in an attitude of profound grief. I stood there, however, for no more than a second, and she vanished without once looking round. Nevertheless, I knew precisely what terrible face she would have shown me. And what if, instead of standing above, I had been below, Would I have found as much courage to ascend the steps as I had recently shown in my encounter with Quint? Well, I still had opportunities to show courage, and not just once. On the 11th night after the meeting with him, all these nights were now counted, I experienced an alarm nearly equal to what would have threatened a new meeting with Quint, and indeed, in its perfect unexpectedness, striking me with the most violent shock. It was the first night when, tired of keeping watch, I felt I could go to bed again at the usual hour without imprudence. I fell asleep quickly and, as it later transpired, slept until 1 o'clock, but, waking then, I sat straight up in bed, completely shaking off sleep, as if a hand had shaken me awake. I had left the candle burning, but now it was extinguished, and I instantly felt certain that Flora had blown it out. This made me leap to my feet and rush straight to her little bed, which was once again empty. A glance toward the window explained everything, and a struck match completed the picture. The girl had risen again, this time having blown out the candle, and again, whether to spy on someone or to signal to them, she had slipped behind the curtain and was peering out into the darkness of the night. This time she saw something she had been unable to see before. I was certain, for she was not disturbed by my relighting the candle, nor by the haste with which I slipped on my shoes and threw on my dressing gown. Concealed from me by the curtain, oblivious to everything in the world, she stood on the window-sill. The window opened outward and stared fixedly into the garden. The moon, as if to aid her, was full, and this helped me decide quickly. Flora was face to face with the apparition we had encountered by the lake, and was now communicating with it, which she had been unable to do then. My task was to reach another window on the same side of the house through the corridor without disturbing her. She did not hear me leave the room, closed the door behind me, and listened for whether she would speak or betray herself with any sound. As I stood in the corridor, my gaze fell upon the door to her brother's room, just 10 paces away, and the sight of it, for some unknown reason, rekindled in me that strange impulse I had recently deemed a temptation. What if I went straight into Miles's room and approached his window? What if, by startling the boy and risking the exposure of my designs, I could cast a long noose over what remained of the mystery? This thought so possessed me that I approached the threshold and stopped again, listening intently. I imagined every terrible thing that could happen. I asked myself if his bed, too, was empty, if he also stood there waiting for someone. A silent minute passed, and my impulse faded. The boy was quiet. Perhaps he was not involved at all. The risk was too great. I turned and walked away. A specter haunted the park, the specter striving to draw attention, the visitor Flora beheld, but not the one who most craved my boy. I hesitated again, though for different reasons, and for only a few seconds, and then I resolved. The house had many empty rooms. The task was simply to choose the right one without error. Such a room presented itself immediately on the lower floor, though set high above the garden. In that massive corner of the house I had already spoken of as the old tower. It was a large, square bedroom, furnished with some opulence, and its extraordinary size made it so inconvenient that it had stood unused for many years, though Mrs. Grose kept it in impeccable order. I had often admired it and knew my way around it. I only had to shudder at first from the unlived-in chill of the room, cross it to reach the window, and open the shutter as quietly as possible. I soundlessly drew the shutter aside, and, pressing my face to the glass, saw at once, for the garden was much brighter than the room, that my chosen direction was correct. Then I saw something else as well. The moonlight lent the night an extraordinary transparency and showed me, on the lawn, a figure diminished by distance, standing motionless as if enchanted. It was looking upward to where I had appeared, that is, not so much directly at me, but at something that must have been above me. Evidently, there was someone else higher still, someone standing on the tower, but the figure on the lawn bore no resemblance whatsoever to the one I had expected and sought to encounter. The figure on the lawn, a wave of nausea swept over me as I recognized it, was none other than little Miles. It was not until a very late hour the next day that I managed to speak with Mrs. Grose. I was determined not to let my charges out of my sight, and this often made it difficult to meet with her privately, especially since we both felt it was crucial not to arouse suspicion among the servants or the children that we were harboring anxiety or engaged in mysterious confidences. Mrs. Grose's imperturbable manner was a great support to me. Her rosy countenance held nothing that could betray to anyone the secret of my dreadful revelations. She believed in me implicitly, this I knew for certain. Had she not, I do not know what would have become of me. I could not have borne it all alone. But this woman was a magnificent monument to the bliss of ignorance and the want of imagination, and as long as she saw in our little charges only beauty and charm, vivacity and talent, she remained happily unaware of all the sources of my torment. Had the children visibly lost weight and grown despondent, she would doubtless have fretted herself thin, wondering what ailed them. But when she stood, her plump white arms crossed upon her chest, and gazed at them with her customary placidity, I would involuntarily catch her thought, "Thank God the children themselves are alive and well, and to hell with all the rest." Her serene good nature, as comfortable and steady as the heat from a hearth, took the place of flights of fancy, and I sometimes noticed how, alongside her conviction that our nestlings could well fend for themselves, she would be seized by a fussy solicitude for their poor governess. This simplified matters greatly for me. I could hope my own face would not betray me, and that no one would notice anything amiss upon it. Yet even under these conditions, having to worry about her ability to conceal her feelings would have been an immense additional burden. At the hour I am describing, she had, at my insistence, joined me on the terrace, where the evening sun, with the change of seasons, shone pleasantly. We sat there together, while the children, in the most peaceful frame of mind, strolled at a distance before us, though close enough that we could call to them if needed. They walked slowly, in step across the lawn, the boy reading a fairy tale aloud as he walked, his arm amiably about his sister. Mrs. Grose watched them in perfect tranquility. Then I caught a suppressed sigh, as if her mental machinery had creaked. It was her appeal to me, her effort to learn my view of the other side of the coin. I had made her the repository of my grim secrets. But in her patient submission to my anguish, there was also a strange admission of my superiority, a respect for my position and my qualities. She opened her soul to my disclosures, and had I mixed a witch's brew and offered it to her, she would have held out her large, clean saucepan. This was reinforced when, recounting the events of that night, I came to the point of what Miles had said to me when I saw him at such an ungodly hour almost on the very spot where he stood now, and had descended to bring him home, choosing that method from the window rather than a more resonant call, so as not to disturb anyone in the house. Meanwhile, I had little hope of engaging her sympathy by conveying the sensation of genuine magnificence, the inspiration with which the boy had met my verbal appeal after I had led him inside. As soon as I appeared in the moonlight on the terrace, he came straight to me, and then, without a word, I took his hand and led him through the dark places up the stairs where Quint had so greedily lain in wait for him, and further along the corridor where I had listened, trembling, and finally into his abandoned room. We exchanged not a word on the way, and I wondered, oh, how I wished I knew for certain whether his vile little mind was seeking some plausible and not too absurd explanation. Of course, it was not easy to invent one, and this time I detected a strangely triumphant note beneath the boy's genuine confusion. It was a cunning trap for one who had hitherto seemed elusive. He could no longer play the innocent, no longer pretend. So how would he extricate himself now? Along with the passionate throb of this question within me beat a silent scream. And how would I extricate myself? I had finally come face to face as never before with all the risk involved in my stubborn desire to get to the bottom of it. Indeed, I remember how, upon bursting into his room, where the bed was not even rumpled and the window, open to the moonlight, illuminated the room so brightly it was not worth striking a match. I remember suddenly sinking onto the edge of the bed, felled by the thought that he must understand everything, that he had, as they say, caught me. Summoning his quick wits, he could do as he pleased, as long as I continued to respect the old superstition that those who guard the young are at fault if they yield to harmful prejudices and fears. He had indeed caught me, and with a forked stick at that, like a snake. For who could justify me, who would agree I did not deserve the gallows if I introduced, by the slightest hint, such a dreadful note into our perfect communion? No, no. It was useless even to try to convey this to Mrs. Grose, just as it is useless to try to set down here how, in our brief, decisive encounter in the dark, he simply overwhelmed me with his composure. Of course, I remained affectionate and gentle to the end. Never, no, never had I clasped his fragile shoulders with such tenderness as in that moment when, leaning against the bed, I questioned him. I had no other choice. The nature of our relations demanded that he speak for himself. You must tell me this instant, and the whole truth. Why did you go out? What were you doing there? I can still see his remarkable smile, see how his beautiful eyes sparkled in the gloom, and his even teeth gleamed between parted lips. If I tell you why, will you understand? My heart faltered then. Could he really be about to tell me? My lips could form no sound, and I answered him only with an indefinite motion, part nod, part grimace. Miles was the very picture of gentleness, and, as I nodded to him, he stood before me more than ever like a prince from a fairy tale. Only his cheerfulness truly brought me relief. Would he be like this if he really intended to tell me everything? Very well. I'll tell you, to make it easier for you. Make what easier? To think me wicked. I shall never forget how gently and merrily he uttered that word, nor how he leaned closer and kissed me. That in essence was the end of it. I accepted his kiss, and, holding him to me for a moment, strove with all my might not to weep. He had told me just enough about himself to prevent me from looking further, and only by pretending to accept it as truth could I look around the room and say, "So you never undressed at all?" His smile flashed in the half-light. "Not at all. I was sitting up reading. And when did you go down?" "At midnight. When I am wicked, I am properly wicked." I see. Very charming. But why were you so sure I would find out?" "Oh, I arranged it with Flora," he answered with perfect readiness. "She was to get up and look out the window. And so she did, meaning I fell into the trap. She woke you, and you, to see what she was looking at, looked out too, and saw me. And all the while you must have been catching your death in the night damp." He positively blossomed after his exploit, and said, his face alight with a smile, How else should I have managed to be so wicked? And after another embrace, both this episode and our conversation ended with me believing in the depth of the virtue from which he could so freely draw. However, right at the end, when he was already in bed and I stood at the door wishing him good night, he raised himself on an elbow. The moonlight, now falling directly on his face, lent it an expression of unchildlike gravity. "Miss," he began softly, and in his voice there sounded a strange, almost pitying note, as if he wished to console me for something. "Just think of what I might have done." These words hung in the nocturnal silence, and I found no reply. They were spoken not as a boast, but as a sad statement, a key he had reluctantly tossed at my feet. I nodded, unable to utter a word, and closed the door, feeling as if that phrase, like a poisoned arrow, had lodged forever in my heart. In it lay the whole secret, all the horror, and all the mockery of my attempts to save him. He knew his power and knew that I knew it. And this knowledge lay between us like an invisible, insurmountable wall. This particular impression, experienced in the night, proved by daylight not entirely suitable for conveying to Mrs. Grose, though I supported it by mentioning another remark of Miles's, made just before we parted. "It consists of just a few words," I said to her, "but such as decide everything. Just think of what I might have done." He threw it at me to show how good he is. He knows perfectly well what he might have done. That is what he made them feel at school. "Lord, how you've changed," my friend exclaimed. "I haven't changed. I only want to prove something." That peculiar impression, experienced in the night, proved by daylight not entirely suitable for conveying to Mrs. Grose, though I reinforced it by mentioning another remark Miles had made just before we parted. "It consists of only a few words," I said to her, "but words that decide everything. Just think of what I might have done." He threw it at me to show how good he is. He knows perfectly well what he might have done. That is exactly what he made them feel at school. "Good Lord, how you've changed," my friend exclaimed. "I haven't changed. I only want to prove something." Rest assured, those two are constantly meeting. If you had been with Miles or with Flora on any of these last 3 nights, you would certainly have understood. The longer I watch and wait, the more strongly I feel. If one cannot catch them at anything else, the obstinate silence of them both speaks for itself. Never, not even by a slip of the tongue, have they hinted at either of their old friends, just as Miles has never once alluded to his expulsion from school. Oh yes, we can sit here admiring them, and they can act out their little play to their heart's content. But even when they pretend to be engrossed in a fairy tale, they're contemplating the dead who have returned to them. "Miles is not reading to Flora at all," I said. "They're talking about them, talking about something monstrous." I know I sound like a madwoman repeating the same thing, and it's a wonder I'm still in my right mind. If you had seen what I have seen, you could not bear it. But my perception has only grown sharper, and it has helped me learn something else. My sharpness must have frightened her, but the lovely little creatures, the victims of this perception, who walked back and forth across the lawn with their arms gently about each other, offered my companion a kind of support, and I could feel how tightly she clung to them as, without resisting the outburst of my distress, she silently followed them with her eyes. "What else have you learned?" "Oh, the very same things that once delighted and charmed me, and yet, deep down, as I now see clearly, puzzled and disquieted me. Their unearthly beauty, their utterly unnatural gentleness. It is all a performance," I continued, "all artifice and deceit. In such dear children, Still nothing but dear little children? Yes, absurd as it may seem. Such a revelation helped make sense of it all, to tie it together. They're not gentle and quiet at all. They're simply absent. They're easy to manage because they live a separate life. They're not mine and not yours. They belong to him and to her. To Quint and that woman. To Quint and that woman. They both want to get hold of them. Oh, how poor Mrs. Grose fastened her gaze upon the children at these words of mine. But for what purpose? Out of love for the evil they both sowed in the children during those terrible days. And for that, they return here to keep pouring more evil into them, to complete their devilish work. Lord, whispered my companion. It was the simplest of exclamations, yet it contained an unmistakable acceptance of what was to come in the future, in the worst of times for us. Yes, there would be times worse than this. Nothing could have been a greater support to me than her simple agreement with my view of the profound wickedness of that vile pair. Clearly yielding to memory, she said a moment later, "They were a low pair indeed. But what can they do now? What can they do?" I echoed so loudly that Miles and Flora, strolling in the distance, stopped and looked at us. "Haven't they done enough?" I asked, lowering my voice as the children, smiling and nodding to us, blowing an airy kiss, resumed their pretense. We were silent for a moment. Then I answered her, "They can destroy the children." My companion turned to me with a question, but asked it without words, which compelled me to speak more precisely. "They don't yet know how to destroy them, but they are striving with all their might. They appear, so to speak, only on the other side and at a distance, in unusual places at a height, on top of the tower, on the roof, outside the window on the far side of the pond. But both he and she show a secret intent, to shorten the distance and overcome the obstacle, and the tempter's success depends only on time. All they have to do is to suggest the idea of danger to the children, so that they go to them and perish in the attempt." Mrs. Grose slowly rose to her feet, and I added hesitantly, "Unless, of course, we can prevent them." Standing before me, I remained seated. She seemed to be pondering the situation. Their uncle must prevent it. He must take them away from here. And who will make him do it? Her gaze was fixed on empty space, but then she turned her bewildered face to me. "You Mississippi, by writing to him that his house is full of infection and that his young wards have gone mad. But if it is so, miss, so I have too, you mean to say? Charming news he will receive from the governess, whose first duty is not to trouble him." Mrs. Grose grew thoughtful, her eyes following the children again. "Yes, he doesn't like to be troubled. That's precisely why. Those two demons deceived him for so long. No doubt, though he himself, one must suppose, was supremely indifferent to it all. And since I, in any case, am no demon, I shall not deceive him." After this, my friend, instead of any reply, sat down again and gripped my hand tightly. "At any rate, make him come to you." I looked at her in surprise. To me? Him. And suddenly I was frightened by what she might do. He should be here. He should help. I rose quickly, and I think she had never seen such a strange expression on my face before. "Can you imagine me inviting him to come?" No. Looking at me, Mrs. Grose was evidently incapable of it. But she could imagine the same thing as I. One woman always understands another his irony, his smile, his contempt for my having proved weak on my own, and for the cunning machinery I had set in motion to draw his attention to my hitherto unnoticed merits. Mrs. Grose did not know, and no one knew, with what pride I had served him and adhered to our conditions, and yet she, I think, heeded my warning. If you were so foolish as to appeal to him on my account, she was indeed frightened. Yes, miss, I will leave both him and you at once. Summoning the children was simple enough, but speaking with them proved beyond my strength. At close quarters, it was just as insurmountably difficult as before. Thus about a month passed, with fresh complications and new shades of meaning, and most significantly, the gentle irony of my pupils toward me grew ever more noticeable. And now, as then, I am certain this was by no means a figment of my infernal imagination. It was not hard to perceive that both of them saw perfectly well how I was suffering, and that this strange state of affairs had created an unusual atmosphere around us. I do not mean to say the children mocked me or behaved rudely. That was hardly the danger. I mean to say that the element of the unnameable and untouchable had come to signify more for us than any other, and that it would have been difficult to avoid much, had it not been for our silent agreement not to touch upon a great many things. Endlessly, topics arose between us that made us stop short, as if before a door leading to a dead end, and suddenly slam it shut with a bang. And hearing that bang, we would exchange glances, for it, like any unexpected sound, was louder than we would have wished, the slam of a door we had incautiously cracked open. All roads lead to Rome, and at times we were struck by how nearly every lesson, every conversation inevitably brushed against the forbidden subject. The forbidden subject was the question of whether the dead ever return at all, and particularly what the children might retain in their memory of the friends they had lost. There were days when I could have sworn that one of them, giving the other an almost imperceptible nudge, seemed to say, "She thinks she's managed it this time. Just wait." And my success might consist, for example, in allowing myself a direct mention of the one who had cared for them before me. They were delighted to listen endlessly to episodes from my own life story, with which I constantly entertained them. They already knew perfectly well everything that had ever happened to me, knew in every detail the most insignificant of my adventures, as well as those of my brothers and sisters, our cat and dog, and a host of peculiarities in my father's character. They knew the entire setting of our home, all the talk of our village gossips. Yet there was still much material to be drawn upon, provided one chattered incessantly and knew where to turn. With their characteristic skill, they pulled the strings of my memory and my inventiveness, and when I recalled such moments, perhaps nothing else aroused in me such suspicion of being secretly observed. In any case, we could converse freely only about my life, my past, my friends, and this sometimes provoked the children, for no apparent reason, to burst into civilities. I would be asked, with no visible connection, to repeat once more old Mother Gosling's famous saying, or to confirm details they already knew concerning the cleverness of the parson's pony. Partly under such circumstances, and partly under quite different ones, given the turn my affairs had taken, it became especially palpable to me that I had fallen into a trap, as I called it, that the days passed without fresh encounters should, it seemed, have calmed my nerves. After the brief collision with the woman's apparition at the foot of the stairs, I had seen nothing more, neither in the house nor outside it, nothing that it would have been better not to see at all. There were many corners where I expected to come upon Quint, and many places which, by their ominous gloom, seemed favorable for the appearance of Miss Jessel. Summer had turned toward its close, then summer had passed. Autumn descended upon Bly and extinguished half our light. The estate, with its gray sky, faded garlands, and bare distances strewn with dead leaves resembled a theater after the performance, littered with crumpled programs. It was precisely the same quality of air, the same alternation of noise and silence, the same elusive impressions, all creating the same setting in which I had first seen Quint on that June evening in the garden, and another time, having spotted him at the window, had later searched for him in vain among the shrubs. I recognized all these signs, all these portents. I recognized both the time and the place. Yet they remained empty and were accompanied by nothing, and I walked on calmly, if one can call calm a young woman whose sensitivity had not dulled, but had been sharpened in the strangest manner. Conversing with Mrs. Grose, I had told her of that dreadful scene with Flora by the lake, and perplexed her by confessing that from that minute onward, it would grieve me more to lose my faculty of sight than to retain it. I had then put into words what stood so vividly before me. Whether the children saw or not was still not conclusively proven. I was prepared to learn the very worst of what still lay ahead. A terrible apprehension suddenly arose in me. What if a veil had lain over my eyes precisely when the children's were at their sharpest? Yes, my eyes, it seemed, had remained shut even now, a mercy for which it would be blasphemy not to praise God. But, alas, therein lay its own difficulty. I would praise him with my whole heart were I not convinced that my charges harbored a secret. Ladies and gentlemen, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part of this work. The full version of Henry James's The Turn of the Screw will be posted on the channel. Share your impressions and thoughts in the comments. I'll be happy to chat with you.